Welcome to the IR Digital Podcast, a part of IR Global, the largest international professional services network. I'm the host of the IR Digital Podcast, Jennifer Riggins. Today, we are sitting down with Michael Einbinder, founding partner of New York City-based business law firm Einbinder Dunn, LLP, with extensive experience both in representing clients and acting as an arbitrator. Today, we're offering you a mix of cautionary tale and proactive tips to answer ahead in writing. You're going to hear that a lot. What happens if and when? Creating and maintaining the right updated documentation in places so your business can survive and thrive and even be sold as it goes through its different phases of change and as your founders or your partners go through those phases of changes as well. So how are you doing today, Michael?
I'm fine. Thank you, Jennifer. Nice to see you.
And to start, why don't you just introduce yourself to the audience?
Okay. As Jennifer said, my name is Michael Einbinder. I'm a partner at Einbinder Dunn in New York City. We have offices in New York and in New Jersey. We have a nationwide practice representing clients from coast to coast in the U.S. in a wide variety of business, transactional, and dispute resolution matters. My experience, when I started practicing law, my experience was in complex commercial litigation. And over the years, it's migrated from being a commercial litigator to being a business lawyer generally, where I also do the dispute resolution I mentioned, but as well, I do a lot of work for clients in their business transactions and in their corporate documents, and in helping them establish and set up a good form set of documents that work for their business and keep them safe and comfortable in terms of dealing with the problems that come up day to day in businesses. What I've also told many of my clients is that there is never a time as meaningful to you in learning what the problems in legal documents are until you're in a fight, until you're in litigation. Because very often we come across cases where documents that were done years before become those that are the subject of dispute. And it's that delay and then not updating those documents that oftentimes creates problems in litigation for my clients. So I use both types of practices that I do to sort of make sure that I understand how best to help my clients and advise my clients on establishing a good set of corporate governance documents.
So they have all their docs in a row.
So they have all their docs in a row. Absolutely. I also just want to add, because Jennifer mentioned this a minute ago, I'm also an arbitrator. So I generally work with, but not exclusively, the American Arbitration Association, which handles cases throughout the United States as well. And I have done about 75 arbitrations in my career as an arbitrator over the last 10 years or so. And a lot of those cases fueled my interest and advice that I give to clients about how to make sure the type of documents we're talking about today are updated, modified, and cleaned up.
So who would benefit from listening to the rest of this episode?
So, we represent small and medium-sized businesses, and we have a number of larger clients, but our biggest client base is in the medium-sized business terrain. And a lot of these companies are closely held businesses. We don't represent a lot of public companies, although we have some public company clients, but it's really small businesses and medium-sized businesses that have established themselves, may have been established for quite a number of years, that you find out that they haven't updated their documents in years. And the people that will benefit most from this, I think, are practitioners, lawyers, and accountants, as well as others involved with small businesses and medium-sized businesses, and making sure, who need to make sure that the type of documentation that I want to address today is put in the form that needs to work for the business as it exists today and as it will exist in the future.
Mm-hmm. So when we spoke ahead, you described yourself as in the contingency business. Without naming names, though that's always fun, can you give us a couple examples of what can go wrong?
Well, I mean, when I say that I'm involved in the contingency business, I also tell my clients that I worry for a living. What I want to do is make sure that my clients don't face the kind of problems that I've seen in litigation for so many businesses, because they haven't done what I suggest, and what I suggest in this podcast, as well as what I suggest to clients on a day-to-day basis. So, the best way to describe this is through war stories. What have I seen, and where have I seen it? And there's so much that I can tell you about. And one of the stories, or one of the things that I've seen, and I tell clients about this all the time, is in a case that I did a number of years ago as an arbitrator, where there was a dispute between the shareholders of a private wealth management firm and the widow of one of the founders of that firm. And to give you an example of how things can go awry, this case is the worst one of the worst ones. She was entitled to have under the shareholders agreement for that company, entitled to have her husband's interest bought out upon his death. She was his beneficiary, so she was getting the money for the buyout. The company started in 1987, and the last shareholders agreement they did was in 1987. And he died in 2012. And I did an arbitration in 2013. And the agreement provided that the buyout price would be $25,000. And that's because they valued the business at $100,000 when they formed it.
So it wasn't that it was a quarter of the business. It was that it was a quarter of what the business value was in that moment.
In that moment. It wasn't updated once. It didn't provide that it could be updated. It didn't provide that it would be at fair market value when the buyout occurred. It didn't provide that the buyout was covered by insurance. This was a new company in 1987. They presumably didn't know if they were going to survive a year. It's small business, By the time we got around to getting into this arbitration, the company had been in operation for many years, and it was worth her interest on a real life valuation basis was worth $1 million.
Mm-hmm. Big difference.
Quite
a few zeros there.
And she was stuck with a $25,000 valuation. And this is about as easy a problem to fix as you possibly can consider. But it's part of an overall issue that we see with small businesses in particular, and sometimes with medium-sized businesses, which is that they didn't provide for any way to value the business other than what they put in the contract when it was signed, the shareholders agreement when it was signed in 1987. There are really easy fixes for this. Some companies require that you do a certificate of value every year. And one of the problems with a certificate of value every year is that nobody actually looks at the shareholders agreement that was drafted by their lawyer in 1987 and thinks about doing that because they're busy being in business. So those certificates of value are a good way to establish a value for a business if you do it every year and you have advisors making sure you do it every year. The other way to do it is to say, if there is no certificate of value, another way to do it, I should say, is the agreement might say that if there is no certificate of value, we do a fair market value analysis. Or you don't even have the certificate of value, you just have the fair market analysis. There's oftentimes a problem in deciding what that means. I mean, there's case law on this, and there are people there will be opinions by various experts about what the value of a company on a fair market value basis is. It's mostly science, but it's a little bit art. And it seems that every time you get involved in these disputes, there is a difference between the valuations of the two expert witnesses. But you can fix that. You can explain what the value is. You can explain how you determine the value. You can explain how if two parties have a different valuation, they choose the middle point or they do something else. There's any number of ways of doing it, but the key is do it. And the problem is where people don't do it. And that comes up so often. Another war story of mine is another arbitration I did, where there were 3 shareholders, family members, a father, founder of the business, and his 2 sons, adult sons, who had established this business about 20 years ago. And a dispute happened in a family. Imagine that never happens. And And it was a business dispute, and the father and one of the sons wanted to get rid of one of the other sons, the other son. And they did it without looking at the documents. And they claimed to have fired him, and they shut his office, and they turned over his computer and stopped his health insurance, and all sorts of things like that. They had a meeting of shareholders that they thought they could do without him, and they never notified him of the meeting because they didn't follow what the agreement said. And they approved the firing of him and the reappointment of other officers of the company. Well, the problem was that the agreement didn't allow them to do that. And they didn't bother to check it. And the resolution they did about that meeting wasn't properly done, because they didn't give notice to the son who they kicked out. And they had to under the agreement as well as the law in New York. And what ended up happening was a business valuation. We ended up doing a business valuation. Here's an example. There were two experts testifying. There was about a $5 million difference between the value of one expert and the other. But in any event, the arbitrators were required to determine the value of the business. And the mistake that they made in not taking the right steps to terminate the employment and ownership stake of the son that they wanted to get rid of, or son and brother they wanted to get rid of, cost them $10 million, because we decided the business was worth $30 million. And if they'd done it the right way, none of this would have happened.
Wow.
And so, I mean, this is a two-part lesson here. The first case I told you about is update your records or make them right in the first place all the time. If you're in business for 20-something years and you haven't had somebody look at those documents in 20 years, or you never did a shareholders agreement, because I can tell you I've seen that a million times, then you're liable to have a problem at some point in time when there's a dispute between founders. Or even when the founders get to a certain age and they want to retire and pass the business on to second generation or sell it.
Or if they die.
And it needs to be clear. And it's very simple. And the problem when it's not done is monumentally complicated. And we've done this, as a litigator, as a client. We have a client who had good reason to terminate the employment and require a buyout of their partner's shares. That was provided for in the contract. But unbeknownst to us, we represented this client for a long time. They didn't follow the dictates of the documentation when they did it. And it just turned into a mess. And so to avoid the mess, everybody should have lawyers or accountants, professionals involved in their business lives that understand this stuff. And what we often find when we get involved in an after the fact problem is they had a friend of the family who does real estate closings do their shareholder agreement. We find out that people are not doing this as much as they should. And the way to clarify it is to take an inventory of what you have in place, if anything, and to make sure it's done the right way and to update it on a continual basis, because things change, rules change, people get older. And this happens more times than I can tell you.
What is a continual basis? How often update?
Well, I think it's easy enough to do this on a yearly basis. I think what we recommend to clients, the first step is to audit what you have. And if the answer is we don't have anything, then we say, okay, we need an emergency meeting, let's have something. But one of the problems with that, though, Jennifer, is that if the discussion comes up about documentation at a point in time when there's a fight among shareholders or owners, that's absolutely the worst time to try and document what the real deal is, because no one's going to agree on it. They're all going to go to their separate corners and make sure that everything is set up the way that's going to be beneficial to them, or they never agree. So the time to do this is before there's a problem. That's critical. But we recommend to clients, show us your shareholders agreement, your employment agreements, your non-competes, your trade secret agreements. I mean, this is not limited to inter-partner problems. It's not limited to what the shareholders agreement or the operating agreement for an operating for a limited liability company in the States provides for. It's critical for every element of your business. So, we have clients who have very important confidential proprietary information that they don't protect with a confidentiality agreement. And if they have a confidentiality agreement, they don't actually maintain the confidentiality of the material that's supposed to be confidential. So there's a lot of trade secret cases about that. One recently came down in New York where it turned on whether or not there was a passcode to certain purportedly secret documents, secret information, proprietary information in the company's in the company's computer system, and people got into it that weren't allowed to get into it because they didn't have any real protection. So you've got to both have a document that covers the confidentiality of your material, and secondly, covers the and a process that governs maintaining that confidentiality. So it's not just lawyering. It's not just putting the documents together. It's actually adhering to it. And what you're supposed to do to make sure that material remains confidential. Oftentimes what we find out about this is businesses are smart enough, their owners are smart enough to get documents done by a lawyer at some point in time. I don't think they actually read them or ask what that means. And so if, it's a 50-50 chance to see whether it works out when there's a problem down the line. But I've represented clients over and over again who said, we had an operating agreement done when we started, and we haven't looked at it since, and I don't think we really know what's in it. And let me see if I can find it. And in one example, I represent a company with 5 partners, and I started my representation of them when they're a franchise company, and when they were changing from one franchisor to another, or trying to, and we ended up getting them out of a franchise agreement with their then existing franchisor. And they asked me to take a look at their shareholders agreements because they wanted to add new offices to what they're doing in the real estate business. They wanted to bring in new partners, and none of that was covered in their documents. And sometimes, sometimes we hear from clients that the way it is covered in the documents was great in 2014, but that's not the way we do business anymore. And we have 5 more partners, by the way. And we didn't issue any shares, and we didn't do anything that we're supposed to. We didn't have them sign an agreement that says they're bound by the shareholders agreement.
And this paperwork isn't required, like if you are getting VC funding or you're getting a loan from a bank, they're not looking for this funding or for this paperwork in order.
So, banks may ask for a shareholders agreement. They ask for resolutions. They ask for a lot of documents, but they don't really analyze whether or not they're covering the kinds of issues that I see. Where we often see a problem is when businesses are being sold and clients are not properly documenting the things they need to do to make sure that they can be sold. And they find out, there's a shareholders agreement, and the shareholders agreement doesn't provide for whether or not the business can be sold. Well, who has to decide whether or not the business can be sold? Who's got control over that? Is it just the majority shareholders, or does it have to be a super majority or unanimous? And so those kind of things crop up all the time. And we've seen the same problem with clients in the franchise field, which, as I told you, Jennifer, is one of the major parts of our practice, where we've had clients acquiring franchise businesses, and that franchise business had 100 franchises, but mediocre to non-existent documents with those franchisees. So that in the due diligence process, what comes up is that we need to get 20 new documents signed before the closing on December 31st. That kind of thing. So I mean, this is sort of straightforward advice for everybody when it comes to your business documents in general. And so we start with sort of that's why I call it an inventory. Really, it's like I want to see what you use when you start your business, what the relationship between partners is, members, shareholders, whether or not there are new owners in the business that change the landscape, or should have changed the documents, whether or not the agreements with employees are in place and properly drafted that allow, for example, for termination of employment, for, we see a lot of agreements that when there are high-level corporate executive kind of agreements, where there's a lack of clarity on what happens if someone gets terminated for cause or without cause, and whether they get severance pay and that kind of thing. So, you look at all of that material. What do the non-competes say? Are they too broad? Can they be used? And, is it going to be a problem down the line if you want to stop someone from going to a competitive company? Same thing with trade secrets and the like. So we look at all of those kind of documents, and the next level document might be the customer facing documents. And in the franchise world, it's going to be the franchise or franchisee related documents and vendor agreements. And another example of that, and another war story that I tell is a restaurant, not a restaurant, well, sort of a restaurant company, let's put it that way, that it's had its own proprietary products, and those products were manufactured by what's called a co-packer, a company that is, you give your recipes to, and they put it in bottles or jars for you, and you can sell it in your store, or you can sell it at retail or something like that. And what we found out in that case is that there's no indication that my client actually owned the recipes. They just gave them, and it was supposedly a big secret. No one's allowed to know about this. And I said, well, let me see the co-packer agreements. The co-packer agreements didn't say anything, and the co-packer was selling the recipe to third parties. So I came up in a fight, with the third parties. So, what you try to do is when you're in my position representing a small, medium-sized business is to try and make sure that all their documents at every level contemplate the potential problems that come down the line and clarify issues that can really create a problem when there's a shift or change in the business or a dispute with a third party or internal.
Is it partly all of these issues the fault of lawyers? Is there onus or responsibility on lawyers that part of their job isn't just to create these documents, but part of the process should be to educate their clients?
No and yes, I think is the way. Sure, it would be ideal if that could happen. That's the yes part. But clients, oftentimes, you send it to the client to read, and then there's a meeting or an exchange of the document around among partners and shareholders, and they sign it. They're not reading it. They're certainly not scrutinizing it. And if they get legal advice, there's a 50-50 chance they're actually listening to it, and a 30% chance they're actually understanding what we're saying. So, the best case scenario would be for a lawyer to say, let's update your agreement every year and send out a notice of some kind, or let's look at it. The clients don't, they've got business to do. They're not worried about the contingencies and the things that I'm worrying about. And you can tell all the people in the world that, you better do this before something becomes a problem. Well, the response to that might very well be, there's no problem yet, so I'll deal with it when there's a problem. I'm busy today, making a sale. So, it's not a top priority for people. You hear stories about people who don't have wills because they just haven't gotten around to it. To me, as a lawyer, I can't even believe that's true. But it's true. And so the same thing with partnership agreements and shareholders agreements. And probably the worst ones are lawyers. They don't do their own partnership agreements. They just write them for other people.
Wow, really?
It does happen. You'd be surprised. If you ask 10 lawyers, if they have 10 lawyers in small firms, at least they have a partnership agreement. I think about 5 of them will say they have. But these are critical, and they oftentimes come up, as I said, when there's a problem. It can be an internal, external dispute. A kid wanting to be involved in the business. Somebody passing away. All of those things are the triggers for finding out that there's a problem. And what's informed me about this has been being involved in litigation and arbitrations about it because I see the problems. You really can't see it. They come into sharp focus when you're sitting there arguing about section 6.5, subsection 4. And you realize that just wasn't done the right way by the lawyers who did it years ago. So that's sort of our advice on a day-to-day basis for clients.
So we could go on and on about the different issues and the different war stories, as you call them, but are there certain types of documents or certain buckets of documents, piles of documents, as it were, or electronic files that every organization that's at least a small or medium-sized business really has to consider and maybe is not considering?
Yes, absolutely. And the ones I've seen where there are deficiencies in those documents. So what we talked about in general is the problems that I see, and it's at a kind of a conceptual higher level basis, in the sense that if you don't get your documents together and you have a problem, these are some examples of what might happen, and this is sort of generally what we need to look at. But let me be a little bit more specific. Every business, small, medium, large, privately held company, every single one of these companies needs to have governing documents. What they need is a shareholders agreement if it's a corporation, an operating agreement if it's a limited liability company, and a partnership agreement if it's a partnership, a joint venture agreement if it's a joint venture agreement. And there's a whole host of things that those agreements have to deal with or have to address. So among other things is who owns what. There are various types of shares that, the shareholders agreement would indicate what kind of shares people own, if there are different classes of shares. In a limited liability company, you can do the same thing as you do in a corporation. It's just got different names associated with it. So that's critical. The voting rights of the shareholders are critical, of course. The requirement to invest more money, making a capital call on members about requiring more money to be invested in the company by the shareholders. And what happens if you don't respond to and invest when there is a capital call? Your shares get diluted or not. Management roles and responsibilities, who's going to actually operate the company day to day and what their job is going to be. Corollary to that is an employment agreement for executives and owners. But just because you're a shareholder doesn't mean you get a salary or a job. That has to be clearly indicated. There are oftentimes provisions of these agreements that allow certain decisions to be made by a majority, a supermajority, which means generally 2/3, or sometimes higher, or sometimes unanimous. And those things have to be spelled out. And there can be a management committee that makes certain decisions. And what you find is that when companies start, they're not doing all of that. And when they are mature and they've seen how their business is evolving and there are more people and different people in it, maybe even different lines of business, that they really do need to think about those things that didn't go into their initial document. All of these are in the agreements. One of the client I mentioned before, again, I get back to war stories because they just come to mind when I say this kind of thing. Because, in one company where there were 5 shareholders that I represent, their agreement as it was initially was that they would, when they started the business 25, 30 years ago, was to share all the profits of the business evenly. Mm-hmm. It didn't require any of them to work, retiring, but they're still getting 20% of the profit of the business. And when they came to me, after 30 years in business and said, what do we do about this? Well, the people who want to retire don't want to change that. So we can't change anything. So, think about it ahead of time. What does that mean? If you've got a small business and people aren't actually working.
And then you can't bring on new people because you can't afford to bring on new people to fill those voids.
That's exactly right. What restrictions are there on transfer? Can your interest, 20% business, 20% of a business, can it be sold to a third party? Is there a right of first refusal in the other owners or in the corporation? Does it have to be approved in all instances? What does the new owner have to do? non-competition provisions in agreements. So if you're in a small business and you don't want somebody to go off and start their own similar business down the street, provide that they can't do that. There's some law that said, some case law on that says you really can't compete with your, there's a duty of loyalty. You can't compete with your company, but if you somehow quit that company, then you can. Just sorry, but another war story. I have a client who was a very small shareholder of the company backed by private equity. And he was a shareholder and he couldn't compete with the company. But he never really realized he was a shareholder. He just kept getting letters that said, here are your shares. When he tried to give them back, he wasn't able to. So it wasn't worth anything. It was underwater. He had no money. There was no value to this business, but he was stuck because shareholders were stuck with non-competes in the shareholder agreement. They couldn't compete at all. So you need to clarify that issue. There are voluntary withdrawals and involuntary withdrawals. If your partners want to get rid of you for some reason because you're not doing anything, that's an involuntary withdrawal. And it's, I want to sell or I want to retire. What happens then? What happens when you're disabled? Those things are parts of shareholders agreements that have to be addressed, and that may be addressed from time to time, in small ways, but not comprehensively. And when there is a new member brought into a business or a new partner brought into a business or shareholder, maybe that's a time to look at your documents to make sure that everything is in good shape. Their documentation concerning succession planning is really critical. We represent and work with a company that specializes in this area that are not lawyers, succession planning situations, where you have to really be careful about how you can pass your interest on to your offspring in some way or another, and who gets it, and whether or not that child gets to be part of the business and have a job or get an employment contract of some kind, and that should be specified. And that as you get to that sort of retirement stage, or bring on my son or daughter phase of the existence of business, you want to make sure that the documentation is established in a way or created in a way that allows you to do that without there being a problem with your partners at some point in time. And if you have a business and you're thinking about retiring, what we've seen a lot of companies do is make sure that a younger generation, not necessarily family members, but a high-level executive in the company that's not an owner, has an incentive to stay with the business, both with pay and possibly equity in an employment agreement of some kind for key employees, especially when you get into the stages that I'm talking about. It's critical to do that. Now, they're in a corporation, in addition to being a shareholders agreement, you do bylaws that establish voting rights and other things, and you should look at that. There's a set form that's often used that when you form a business in New York, but people don't look at it or don't sign it. I've seen businesses where people bring in new partners and there's no agreement of any kind. Someone just invests some money. So you got to be clear about capital contributions. You got to be clear about what that brings to you in terms of ownership interest and how that might change the stock ownership of the business. So every time, and the voting structure and all of what I talked about before. So every time you do any sort of deal where you're bringing in a partner or contemplating bringing in a partner, you really need to look at your documentation, see what it says about doing that, and at the same time make a decision about what it should look like the day after. What's the new person going to sign when they become part of the company? And I mentioned before, a purchase and sale of a business or acquisition of some kind. There's a whole host of documents that we recommend that people keep in shape for this, and that would include shareholder agreements and non-compete agreements and employment agreements of any kind, and keep their documents in a place that's clear, that can be found and turned over. Transactions like this get delayed all the time by companies where the documentation either is non-existent or is inaccessible or not clear, or it's not clear where it is.
It makes sense because these are things just like putting off a will or living will or anything like that. these are all very awkward conversations for people, especially that are starting a business together to do. So it makes sense that they put it off, and it takes time when they're ramping up and focusing on their business so much. So how do you impress upon clients that like the importance of this? So I guess your war stories, but I understand why people would procrastinate this. It's not fun. No offense.
No, I don't think any of this is fun. I mean, this is rainy day stuff also. So it's not going to affect their day-to-day operations of their business, or, you know, if they sell, you know, if they're sales organization or manufacturing organization, they're really focused on transactions and sales. They're not focused on this. You know, I would like to think that war stories make people do these things. I would like to, I don't know, truthfully. I mean, I'm not on the other side of the table from my clients. You know, some clients listen and do what I suggest they do, and some say, oh, let me think about it. I'll talk to my partner. Or they're both in the room and we'll talk about it. And the problem is often that there's little incentive to do it, even the conversations that I'm talking about, where I say, listen, here's an example. You don't want your wife to get $25,000 when your business is worth $10 million, do you?
And they're not even married yet. Yeah, it just seems too far off for them.
Right, exactly. And, you know, and I've got a 5-year-old kid. You know, am I really going to think about succession plan? Yes, you will. You should. And your partner should, because they may not want your kid when he's 30 to be their partner.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, so you tell clients this, they listen, they take note, and then they go back about their business. So it's sort of hard. I think, you know, we try to be trusted advisors to our clients, and think of ourselves as someone that they should call when they're doing anything important that might be impacted by all this. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's sometimes good for accountants and lawyers for a business to talk about it and say, you know, what do you think about what's going on in this realm? Can we get the partners to sit down and have a conversation about the contingencies in business and life, and what they're going to do about it? So it's hard, Jennifer. It's just not something that people always listen to. I'm hopeful that a conversation like this, I don't know who's going to be listening to this specifically. I'm assuming some lawyers, some accountants, and some businesses. So let's assume it's those people who are listening to this should take notice of this, and they should deal with it and try and figure out what to do. But, you know, I don't know if they will.
Absolutely. And because I think you lead to many, many, many more questions than answers, or answers being documented and revisited often and talk about these things. But if our listeners want to touch base with you to learn more about you, your legal services, and if they have any more questions, what's the best way to connect?
So the best way to connect with me is on email. My email address is me@ed-lawfirm.com. Our website is ed-lawfirm.com. So there's information about our practice and our partners and what we do. Sometimes blogs about this kind of thing, and any material you want. I'm happy to talk to anybody about it and make referrals if I need to make a referral. But we, as I said, we do this all over the country. And you know, it's sometimes state specific laws, but you know, we can get information on that if we need to. We can refer people out to people. I'm happy to help in any way I can.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, listeners. These IR Digital podcasts are meant to be educational resources from experienced lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors, these trusted advisors that we were just talking about, with extensive knowledge on topics you as professionals actually really need to know about. Today was one of those, right? To learn more about IR Digital and its services, please visit irglobal.com. And if you found this episode useful, please consider sharing it. Thank you so much.